So yeah, I'm Paula Serafini. I'm a lecturer in creative and cultural industries at Queen Mary University of London. And today I'm going to be talking about this book, Creating Worlds Otherwise, and about art in struggles against extractivism, basically, and sharing a bit of the process with you and also some of the findings from this research that I did in recent years. But first of all, I thought it would be useful to explain briefly what I mean by extractivism or how I use it in my work. Extractivism can usually be understood as one of two things, either a phenomenon that, we can talk about a phenomenon that we can observe, or a framework of analysis. As a phenomenon, extractivism has usually been defined as an economic model based on intensive and extensive extraction of nature for resource. This is the definition, for instance, that Maristela Vampa and Enrique Viade use to Argentinian researchers. So it's something that we can see in many Latin American countries, but also in other places in the global South. Economies that are centered around open pit mining, fracking, large-scale agriculture, deforestation, and so on. But extractivism can also be understood as a framework of analysis because it is a framework that has been developed at the beginning by Latin American scholars, but nowadays we have people in many parts of the world using this framework. And it serves to analyze the conditions of a society that is affected by this kind of economic model. So trying to understand the effects of extractivism beyond just the economic and also looking at the environmental consequences, but also the social, political, and cultural consequences. And I decided to use extractivism in this book because it is the term used by movements on the ground and by artists themselves. So I felt it was important to use it to reflect the way that people frame their experiences and their views of the world, but also because I think politically right now, extractivism is an important perspective to bring to the center of our analysis of the ecological crisis. And I think I'll return to that towards the end. So I did fieldwork in different points of Argentina for this project, researching art, culture, and collective action against extractivism. This was mostly between 2017 and 2019, but the book includes some events that happened a bit after that because I always kind of keep connected. I'm from Argentina myself, so this thing of like doing fieldwork, yeah, there was a period, an official period of fieldwork, but also the work continues. And it also involved research collaborations and artistic collaborations with people over there, which I can talk about maybe a bit later. I would say my work is interdisciplinary, to give you an idea of where I'm coming from, because it brings together elements from art theory, but also from cultural studies, from sociology, from political ecology, from political ontology. And I probably shouldn't describe myself as interdisciplinary, but rather as undisciplined or undisciplinary, because I don't really fit in one discipline. I've studied different things for each degree. I've never been in a clearly disciplinary department either, but I mostly align or identify with the project of cultural politics, we could say. And the work follows from previous work that I've done on art activism, and that work was mostly concerned with the internal dynamics of art activist practice. I was interested in how groups, collectives negotiated artistic and political objectives in their work, and I was looking mostly at performance-based types of actions. And there I was trying to find commonalities between different groups, different kinds of campaigns, that I was trying to see whether there was any commonality in how those objectives, aesthetic and political, were negotiated. And then for this project, I realized that I actually wanted to concentrate more on context and how a particular context conditions the ways in which art activism develops and the socio-political functions of artistic practice. So the hypothesis of this work was that the particularities of Latin American extractive societies condition the ways in which art functions politically to oppose extractivism and create worlds otherwise. And some of these particularities include the erosion of democratic mechanisms, a lack of state response, obfuscation, I can never pronounce that word, on behalf of mainstream media outlets, the hegemony of a neo-colonial development paradigm rooted on extraction and growth, an extractive approach to nature, and national imaginaries built around extraction. So a lot of these are common to many Latin American countries, but my work, the field work was done entirely in Argentina, and in the book, there are different ways in which I kind of switch from a Latin American context to an Argentina-specific context, which I guess is easier to read and to see than to explain. Now, this is a book. It came out in July 2022. Since then, things have changed a lot in Argentina, for the worse, but perhaps we can talk about that later. And I'll move on to tell you a bit more about the content of the book. So I'm going a bit fast, maybe just because I want to get over the text-heavy slides, so then I can move on to show you some photos, some examples of some of the work I look at in the book. I do two things in this book. The first is to document the narratives that emerge from collectives that stand against extractivism and for post-extractivist worlds. And then how these narratives are then communicated through these different forms of artistic practice. So I structured the 6 chapters of the book around these narratives, which are territory, ecofeminism, human rights and the rights of nature, urban and cultural extractivism, sovereignty, autonomy, and self-determination, and post-extractivism and alternatives to development. And the other thing that I do in the book is to propose a framework of analysis that consists of 5 functions. And the functions are, they all start with the letter D, which was a coincidence. I always make a point of saying this. And I think in my subconscious somewhere, it was because I was a big fan of The Sandman, a graphic novel, where all the characters' name starts with D. But it actually works. And the 5 functions are denunciation, documentation, democratization, deconstruction, and design. And what I propose is that all these artistic practices that emerge from the movements against extractivism or in connection to these movements, they fulfill one or more of these functions in response to the context created by an extractive society. So what I'll do over the next few minutes is to show you some examples of this and to explain a bit what I mean by each of these functions. So the first one is denunciation. Denunciation is a term that's used a lot in Spanish, like denuncia. In other contexts, it's a term that doesn't translate as well. But again, I use the terms that use on the ground, and if they don't work in other contexts, then that's not for me the biggest issue. Although it lends itself to interesting conversations as well, this matter of translation of terms. With denunciation, I refer to the way in which artistic practices but also alternative media practices have to fulfill this role of speaking truth to power, of visibilizing the things that are invisibilized, that are purposefully hidden by the government, by the hegemonic media, by corporate actors, around the effects of the extractive industries and the effects that they have on the environment, but also in terms of democratic mechanisms and so on. A lot of these practices have the purpose of breaking through a regime of visibility that is installed through extractivism, in which these industries are presented as technologically advanced, innocuous, future-oriented, progress-oriented, when in fact, when one goes to the territories, the reality is very different and the regimes of visibility are different. or the manifestations, the visual manifestations actually are different. There are a lot of visual practices that do this, but also a lot of performance-based practices that denounce the culprits of the perpetuation of extractivism by occupying spaces of power or symbolic significance. So this image is from a performance by a group called Fuerza Artística de Choque Comunicativo, or Artistic Force of Communication Shock. And it was a performance called Who Chooses? ¿Quién elige? That was carried out at 4 points throughout Argentina in 2017 on the same date, targeting the sites that are representative of systems of power and systems of extraction. So here, for instance, they are outside the quarters of the squad of the Gendarmerie squad that was responsible of the repression operative that resulted in the disappearance of Santiago Maldonado, who was an activist standing in solidarity with Mapuche communities over a land conflict in Patagonia. And well, I can tell you a bit more about these performances, but this group usually does this thing of occupying sites of power or of symbolic significance for long periods of time, as a way of identifying and marking those spaces and the culprits that are in those spaces. A second and in many ways related function is that of documentation. So something that happens a lot is that when people bring up the effects of extractivism, effects in health, or in this issue of violation of rights, or economic effects, and so on, authorities don't respond. They do not document what is happening, and if anything, they try to hide evidence of what is happening. And many artists end up taking the role of documenting these effects, which ends up kind of fulfilling several different social functions. So one of the functions is to act as actual evidence. So these images by photojournalist Paula Serafini ended up being used as evidence in a court case for the defense of children's rights to health. He was documenting the human cost, as the title of the work says, of agrochemicals, particularly the use of glyphosate in GMO agriculture. So art can actually fulfill that role of providing evidence of what is happening. But also there are other artists that are working with archives or creating their own archives as a way of memorializing the movements against extractivism as they develop. Again, because there is a lack of documentation, because the media delegitimizes, dismisses, even persecutes these movements. So artists are also fulfilling that role of giving memory, creating a memory of those actors, particularly those that pass away and that have been critical to the development of this movement. The third one is democratization. And by this, I mean, in the first instance, two things: democratization of information and the democratization of the act of art making. So I looked at how different collectives fulfill this role through their practice, and how that in turn gives place to the democratization of narratives around development, around extraction, around the economy, and around what kind of society we want to live in. So this is an example from Córdoba, which is a province in the center of the country. And this collective, Casa 1, 2, 3, 4, uses graphic design and printing. This is silk print, as a way of working with families of victims of police violence, but also they work with environmental groups. And they bring their tools and work with people and teach people a craft so that they can themselves produce content that contributes to public narratives around these issues. And this, in this particular context, in the Argentinian context, we can also link this back to existing traditions of popular arts, of self-organized or autogestionado arts, and of arts as a social practice, which had to do also with public policies and with political traditions and so on. The fourth one, close to the end, is deconstruction. And I use deconstruction in the sense that feminist activists use it, meaning to undo, to challenge the ingrained colonial and patriarchal ideas in society, such as the gender binary, the culture-nature divide, but also in the case of Argentina, this ingrained idea of civilization over barbarity, which was part of the kind of foundational ethos of the country, and that contributed to the genocide of indigenous people, but also to the fact that until today, a lot of these violent origins of the country are still unquestioned. So this work, just to briefly give you an idea, it was made by a student teacher in Patagonia, in the city of Esquel, and it's called Barbarity Over Civilization. So it kind of reverts that slogan of civilization over barbarity. And he chose sites of symbolic power in the city that served to show how this colonial mentality and of supremacy is still sustained till today. But also he marked sites that show the new actors that perpetuate violence against indigenous people, such as the associations that bring together landowners. So he marked the sites, he brought skulls and bones made of papier-mâché to the sites, and it was quite a bit of a scandal when he did it, because he was kind of challenging the official history, trying to deconstruct the idea that the process, the conquest of the desert, as it was called, was the triumph of civilization over barbarity, and actually turning this on its head and saying that was barbarity and it's going on until today. It's just that the actors have slightly changed. In the book, I talk a bit also about how deconstruction, in the sense, is a step towards decolonization of knowledge through the arts too. And finally, we have design. And what I talk about in the book, particularly in the last chapter, is how artistic practices facilitate the imagining and implementation of alternative structures, economies, and ways of being. And I talk about ontological design, and specifically political ontological design, because these practices, I argue, are part of political ontological struggles, which are not just about, issues of compensation or of appropriate environmental planning and so on. They are struggles about what is at stake in the first place. And that makes them ontological struggles. They're struggles which are not just about material issues, but also about worlds colliding in many ways. And this is what we see more and more of in socio-environmental conflicts across Latin America. So I take the notion of designs that Arturo Escobar develops in Designs for the Pluriverse, and I kind of apply it to the analysis of artworks and look at how different artistic practices can design ways of being, in addition to designing, as in this case, for Iconoclasistas, a map. I focus here not only on the map that they produce with communities in areas of conflict, but also about the process and the socialities that they produce, that they design in the process of making these maps. Which is perhaps the most interesting development, or what comes from these collaborations between artists and communities and territories in conflict. Final thoughts. Well, actually, this was a kind of very, very express, quick overview of the book. I hope it makes sense anyway, but I wanted to say a bit about why I wrote it, or what I think is the intervention that the book makes. And right now, I'm kind of improvising here, right? So this might change depending on when you ask me. But right now, what I'm thinking about is how the book tries to look at something that's very context specific and explain it in a very contextualized way, with grounded theory, with looking, with historicizing also some of the artistic practices, and with looking at the particular local context, but also trying to make it universal in the sense that I'm focusing on artistic practices as a particular aspect of the struggle against extractivism. And there is something about artistic practice that is relatable, that is understandable, even if the context is not. And I think in that sense, I hope that the book makes these struggles a bit more available or accessible to people who might not connect with them or read about them otherwise. But I also want to make the case for extractivism, which has become not only my academic work, but also one of my political causes, which is discourse on the climate crisis is lacking. It's not enough. And we have to always look at extractivism as the other side of the narrative of climate change and the ecological crisis in the global north, but also as the other side of the narrative on transitions in the global north, because transitions in the way that they are conceptualized, at least by mainstream green agendas, involve more extraction in the south. So as long as that development paradigm is not questioned, is not challenged, then the South will continue to carry the burden of extraction. That's why I think extractivism is an important lens to always keep in mind when talking about the ecological crisis. So I think I'm gonna leave it there because I went over my 20 minutes. But thank you for listening. I hope it wasn't too dull with the slides.
No, it was great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Not dull at all. Anybody want to jump in with questions? Feel free, please.
I guess,
Stephen.
Yeah, I'll just start. As you're going through the 5Ds, I was thinking, in a way, while you developed them in a very particular local context, they actually are quite applicable to other places in the world as well. And so I guess my question to you is, what is particularly Argentinian about those 5Ds that might not be applicable to, say, West Africa, which is also has a history of extractivism, or actually any other region in the world? And even regions of the world where extractivism isn't the primary sort of political struggle.
Well, I actually don't know, but I guess for me it was also trying to make the point of how this was contextualized. I mean, I'm really happy to hear that other people do think they are applicable to other contexts, because it means that then it can be useful beyond that context. But I think it was my way of reacting perhaps to feeling annoyed quite often by writing and research that assumes that doesn't mention the context where it's coming from, and therefore assumes applicability across the board, when actually that tends to be the problem a lot of the times, when we don't contextualize things and then assume that they apply everywhere, and then those frameworks end up being applied for research in global south countries, and then it doesn't work, and then that leads to misunderstandings of situations. So I guess it was my way of saying, like, it was a reaction to that in how I position what I do. But yeah, and also kind of trying to be humble. Like, I think I have the sense that it might apply to other contexts with similar economic models and similar social situations and politics, but I don't know it for sure. So I'm not going to assume that it is. But yeah, I think particularly now, in terms of democracy, of media, persecution of environmentalists, there's so much that is applicable, even here in the UK. So unfortunately, I think some of it. But in terms of, also I would say in terms of the specificities, to the Latin American context more broadly, I would say there's this thing of the imaginary of provider of nature, destiny of provider of nature that's so ingrained in local imaginaries and mentalities that makes critiques of development very difficult, and that then also facilitates some of the other contextual factors that the artists respond to.
Thank you. Anybody else has a question? Elspeth.
Thank you, Paula. That was really fascinating. There's some overlaps with a typology of creative activism that I can send you, including two specific documentation and denunciation or disruption that maybe was actually being developed about the same time you were writing the book. So different ideas on different sides of the world, but about the same kind of things. But actually what I wanted to ask you was, because I do research into performance, and you mentioned about the commonalities between performance activist groups, and also I was really interested in how the groups are using denunciation with that performative based action outside symbolic places. Can you just briefly talk a little more about what performative action has in common in that Argentinian context, what you found that those groups are doing that's the same?
Okay, thanks for the question. And yes, please do send me the typology. That'd be great to read. So I haven't actually kind of focused on developing that question specifically of what do they have in common as performances. I was kind of trying to look at the function. I had this idea of sociopolitical function in my brain that kind of drove the analysis. And that's why people refer to me as a sociologist, even though I never actually claimed the term. But I guess there are a few things, and the first one that I would go to is the understanding of public space, the ownership of public space. That I think it's a very, as someone who lives in the UK, it's a very different relationship to how public space is understood here, and even to what public space is here, because in the UK, a lot of places that we would think are public are actually private. There's no ownership of the streets. You have to ask for permission before you do anything in the streets, supposedly. Whereas in Argentina, specifically, even at times like this, where there is an authoritarian government, where they have threatened to put in jail anyone who cuts the road and blocks traffic, we still own the streets. There were 400,000 people on the street this Sunday, the day of commemoration of the last dictatorship, even though there have been threats since the new government came into power, that anyone cutting traffic would go to jail. And that goes as well for artistic performances. Protests are spaces for performance, or spaces for artistic expression, and that has been the case for decades. And so I think that's something that all of these groups have in common, the kind of mass group performance in the street as a form of protest is something, the attitude of like the street as our territory from which we act would be the commonality. But then there are also, for instance, many cases of satirical performance, humor as one of the factors that brings groups together. This thing of we could even say the carnivalesque as well. There's a lot of that happening. And there's another case that I look at in the book that is quite funny. That's called Pagan Procession of the Pampas Grass. And it's a work that it's like a totem of this Pampas grass, which is South American species that became invasive in Spain and in other European countries. So they kind of create a whole totem of the plant, and it's kind of like a reivindication of the plant as a new colonizer, reverting the role of colonizer and colonized, and also kind of making the plant, which is a non-human being, the savior of humanity, the one who is going to Europe and to colonize. So they also and give estampitas, which are usually these little cards with saint figures on them, but with the pampas grass, they give them away marches. And that's the other thing that a lot of these performances have, that they're very participatory, and they feed off the energy of the crowd. So yeah, I don't think I have a very straightforward answer, but that's some of a bit of a glimpse of the stuff that's going on.
That's beautiful. I love that, the pagan procession of the pampas grass going back and reversing the invasion. It's really beautiful.
Go, Michelle.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Paula. That's such a fascinating presentation and definitely fascinating book. I'm like in the middle of editing a book on the relationship between art and ecology in East Asian, Southeast Asian context, and I'm using artistic remediation as a kind of framework. And I actually also definitely talk about or touch upon extractivism, and I think there are so many points I can borrow from your book. Definitely, I'm going to cite your book. It's fascinating. Great. Yeah, and definitely, I really appreciate this contextual kind of approach, right? Which I think definitely is going to enrich and enhance the global discourse on art and ecology. So I really appreciate that. And I don't think I have a particular question, but I do like to hear a little bit more about like one of the points you made, concluding kind of thoughts. You're saying like you want to make the other side of extractivism more clear. And so I would like to hear a little bit more about what you meant.
Mm-hmm. Sure, thank you. So I guess there's living in a lot of this comes from my experience living in the UK and joining environmental movements here. And I think it's gotten a bit better lately. But for a long time, the narrative on climate crisis was precisely very universalist and we're all on the same boat, and a kind of, this is something that's going to happen in the future. Where actually it's not happening in the future, not just because some islands are disappearing, as we know, but also because extractivism is not technically climate change, but it is part of the ecological crisis if we look at the devastating effects. So I guess I go to extractivism because I think climate change as a framework or as an organizing concept lives out a lot of forms of ecological violence that are not the result of climate change, but actually forms that come with the causes of climate change. So the violence that comes from oil extraction is not just the CO2, it's what happens in the areas where extraction happens. Is the petroviolence, it's the economic inequality that emerges in oil extraction towns, and the same with mining. A lot of gender-based violence in those areas, a lot of ecological destruction, that is then related to heightened emissions and so on, but it's a different, we could say, form of ecological violence. So that's why I decided, like, okay, for me, I'm going to stick to extractivism. That's going to be my flag, because I want to bring attention to these things that are happening that are not as visible. Unfortunately, now in more parts of Europe, the extraction is becoming more visible because it's coming from outside just the margins and the peripheries and onto other places. But I guess that's what I meant with bringing it to the forefront. And in terms of transitions, for instance, in Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia, you can find, depending on which report you use, because they all differ, but around 70% of the world's lithium. So all the extraction of lithium for cars, for batteries, for renewables, all that comes from extraction that is in those areas. And the ecological effects are really, really bad. And also there are a lot of communities opposing it, because it means they are displaced from their lands, and their forms of survival and their economies are affected because of the use of water and that this results in. So that's why I want to kind of bring attention to this, to the things that are happening already, and that could even get worse as a result of a poorly planned transition that just aims to maintain levels of consumption and production, but with renewables.
Go ahead, Julia.
Oh, you're on mute.
You're muted.
Thank you for the presentation. I would just like to ask you if you could expand a bit more, like the last section of your book was art and post-extractivism. And I think in the context of this, of our group, it's really interesting to think about this more prefigurative dimension and this more dimension of the proposal or even of the utopia. And I would like to ask you if you could maybe develop this a bit more.
Mm-hmm. Sure, thank you. So, you know, I was thinking today, just before we started, I was thinking, I haven't read my book in a while. I don't remember what I wrote in it. And actually, chapter 6 is the one that is, ironically, it's my favorite one, because it's the one where I kind of cut loose a bit. And I think it's the nicest one to read. And there I start experimenting a bit with kind of undoing disciplines, right? So one of the things I look at, for instance, is what's the relationship between agroecology? So see, now it's coming back to me as I speak. What's the relationship between art and agroecology? And how can the interaction between art and agroecology help us in creating other worlds? So I look at the work of artists that collaborate with agroecological producers and the way in which both the artists in their processes and in their participatory practices and the agroecologists in their work, they reproduce relational ontologies that challenge the extractivist paradigm. And then I look also at cultural production and ways of cultural production that try to navigate the different understandings of artist and worker and put together networks of care. So I guess it is a bit experimental, that last chapter, but the point of it is that the logic of extraction permeates every aspect of life. So it's not just the economic, but it's also the social and the cultural. And the way to move past that is to try to counter that by creating other kinds of ontologies, relational ontologies that counter the dynamic of extraction that comes from above. Yeah, right now, to be honest, it's very difficult to see utopia. To see, I don't know, I've been really, with everything that's happening in the world, it's a hard time to be positive. But I'll tell you what kind of keeps me going a bit is human connection, really, and connecting with others in other places. So even though my book is very looking at the local, it's actually when I meet people from other places and we connect in ways of seeing the world that I feel is a way forward. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Does anybody else have another question? Yes, Elspeth. Oh, Dipti, you're next.
Dipti,
That's
yeah.
okay. Thank you, Paula. That was really very, very interesting. And I come from the arts, so I come from a different perspective altogether. But I'm just really interested in you talking a little bit more about the relationship between extractivism and indigeneity, whether it's the Mapuche or it's other indigenous communities, because their understanding of the world is radically different from our colonial understanding of the world. And so, you know, if from your, you know, did you look at any indigenous communities and their forms of resistance against extractivism and what they might be doing that is similar, different?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you for that question. So yeah, so I work mostly with Mapuche communities. And one of the reasons I did that, and I still do that, is because they are particularly persecuted by the national government and by the media, because the lands that they are defending and the lands that they are claiming back are strategic lands for continuing extraction and real estate projects and so on. And they talk about extractivism. They frame their struggle against extractivism, but they also use two other terms. So one of them is ecocide, and the other one that Mapuche, particularly the Mapuche women, have been using lately is terricide. Mm-hmm. And under the concept of terricide, they include the killing of the land, but also of the culture that they are resisting. Mm-hmm. So they use it as a holistic term to represent the advance of the colonial and capitalist state. And their struggles have been particularly demonized by the media. Moira Millán was recently here, who is a Mapuche leader, and she's been persecuted as well.
Do they use the arts differently?
Well, it depends. There are, for instance, like young Mapuche people who use music as a way of resistance against extractivism. So there's a band, a rock ska band called Puelcona, that they have songs that are very explicitly against extractivism. But then there's also all the struggle to preserve traditional culture, because the whole kind of context is not very conducive to sustaining those traditions. And there's a lot of work that's been done, for instance, when I was in Neuquén also, because there are Mapuche communities in different provinces. Now there are more like organized schools for teaching language and for teaching traditions, so that is not lost. They also do very interesting actions that, you know, we could read them as from the lens of performance, if we want, such as walks. There was a walk organized by the Mujeres Indígenas por el Buen Vivir, which is a group of indigenous women for good living from different indigenous groups across the country, and they walked from different points of the country to the capital to deliver a demand to the government, because a lot of them are facing not only territorial conflicts, but also they are victims of sexual violence. They are facing hunger and living in conditions that are not okay. So they went from these different points of the country to deliver these demands, and their walks were recorded, and they would stop at different points to talk to people, to tell them about the struggle. So we could also read that, you know, potentially as a durational performance, because the whole point was that it was a slow process, that it was carrying the territories with them as well.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Elspeth, you had a question, I think.
Yeah, it's actually a kind of related question, Paula. So you talked about the continuing relationships that you have. So I'm assuming you have these ongoing connections with the Mapuche, for example. And I was wondering about the practical balancing that and finding time for it when we function as academics within the neoliberal university, and we're actually sometimes under this pressure for our research to be almost a form of extractivism, to take this knowledge, and yet these relationships have to be reciprocal. We have to mobilize something within these communities. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you manage those long-term continuing relationships and keep them working in the way they should be working.
Yeah, thank you for a question. So I guess it depends on the relationship, and like so I met so many people doing this work, and with many of them I kept in touch, with others not so much. I always tried to put to their disposition the kind of platforms that I have and the skills that I have. So, you know, distributing information, if possible, sharing funding opportunities, translating things, sharing invitations, paid invitations for doing things, trying to use all of my kind of resources I have here and the privilege and access to things that I have here, to redistribute that. And I do that also with funding, when I try to get funding from here to do stuff there and so on. It's very hard to keep all the relationships going. I I also try to do that sometimes outside academia, so through activism and artistic collaborations and other forms as well. But it has not been possible for me to maintain all of the relationships. And I know that in some cases, you know, like I often think, oh, I should write to this person. And then it's like, it's impossible to keep them all. But I think it, you know, the key is to be honest from the beginning with people about what you're doing and see if they're up for it, and not promising things that you cannot do. Try to understand what their expectations are, what they would like to get from the collaboration or from the exchange. Yeah, I totally get your concern with the extraction, because these things then, you know, advance our career. So we get a salary from doing this work. And yeah, one of my struggles right now with the university, my day-to-day struggle, is getting people paid in Latin America when I do things, because they say they want to collaborate internationally, but then the mechanisms in place don't allow us. Yes, I see a lot of nods. We've all been there. So yeah, also trying to try to change those systems in the university, to call them out for what they are, and how they contradict the supposed university values and objectives. So yeah, trying to push a bit on all those levels and doing what we can.
Thank you. That I was more, rather than thinking there was anything with your relationships, I was more wanting to learn from you how you have kept them going in terms of pushing in my own spaces. So thank you. That's really, really helpful.
Thanks.
Yeah. I had a question too. You mentioned that your work is, the extractivism is still the framework that you're moving forward and you continue developing. After this book, what has been the next step for you? Or what next steps are you contemplating within that framework as you've learned from this previous step and moving forward?
Oh, good question. So there are two things I'm interested in developing. So one I started developing actually. So I'm interested in the role of arts and culture production, so broader sense, in socio-ecological transitions. So I'm using the term socio-ecological transitions rather than energy transition, for instance, or just transitions, because I borrow this also from Maristela Svampa and other Latin American scholars that talk about a total transformation of society in an era of climate crisis. And I'm interested in the role that culture can play in that. So not just as a platform for communicating ideas and visions and utopias and imaginaries, but also as places where we can model forms of production, processes of production, structures, and so on. The arts, as we know, have always been kind of at the avant-garde of imagining ways of doing things. So I'm trying to think about how that can be part of a society-wide transition process. It's not, I don't know how yet, but I'm trying to get money to do it. Send me good energy, because I'm in the process of that. And I managed to get a few small pots to do some work in Argentina with cultural partners. So people who are in different parts of what is called the cultural industries, which is a whole other thing we could get into some other day, like music, digital, museums, cultural management, film. And there are some people within those fields that they operate under a very kind of capitalist economy, but they're also very interested in radical change and anti-extractivism and sustainability in its more political sense. So we got those people together, we did a laboratory, we're going to publish something soon about culture and anti-extractivism, and hoping to do something else there. Yeah.